And now we're joined here in the studio by Stephen Clark. Stephen is a Director for Relations with Citizens and the Directorate General for Communication in the European Parliament, where he's responsible for visitors, facilities, and programs, as well as managing public events and information campaigns for the institution. Well, thank you, sir, very much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
We appreciate it. It is European Day, so as we kind of take a look back and look forward, the European Union is, of course, open to expansion. It has a few member states, potential member states that could join. So I guess to begin, how can the last enlargement, which we just celebrated 20 years of, the 10 countries joining the European Union, how can they serve as a model for the new countries which aspire to join the European Union? And what expertise do you think they can provide? How can they help?
Well, I mean, firstly, having gone through the experience of the big enlargement in 2004, that we've learned a lot of lessons about just the technicalities, the nuts and bolts of enlargement, how it needs to work, incorporating new languages, bringing new members into the system, members of parliament, into the system, and so on. The whole machinery of voting and deciding in the council is also needs to be adjusted to cope with the larger numbers of players in the system. But we're not facing anything on the same scale as we had back in 2004. So I think it should be something that we will cope with as we coped with the last one, perhaps a little easier, more easily. But what, of course, it does, it opens up whole new perspectives. The 2004 enlargement opened up another half of Europe, in fact. It was a reunification of previously divided Europe. It brought in a new worldview, if you like. Obviously, the borders of the European Union moved a long way to the east, up to the borders of the former Soviet Union, in fact, beyond in the Baltic states. And this meant that as it were, the political sensibilities that came into the European Union changed and evolved. And that's been very noticeable, for example, now with the Russian aggression in Ukraine, that the western part of Europe has learned a lot from the experience of the eastern part of Europe and has taken a lead very often in how to react to the Russian aggression and how to deal with that. And that's been, well, it's an obvious change. The next enlargement will bring with it other changes, particularly if that enlargement includes Ukraine, of course.
Mm-hmm. And potentially similar experiences.
Indeed. We were looking at European integration, but also I know that in your job you travel quite a lot, and I suppose you get to speak to a lot of people. In recent years, we've obviously seen Brexit at the moment. Hungary is an example of, let's say, Euroscepticism, to say the least. Would you say that the EU is due for some reforms? What would you say are the greatest challenges that the EU faces at the moment?
You could say the EU is always ripe for reform. It's a moving target always, and it evolves through events, through crises, and reforms come when they're needed. And I think as we look forward, I say to having potentially a lot more member states, there will have to be some sort of institutional reforms to make the machinery work smoothly. This has already happened last time. It will presumably happen again. Yes, you mentioned there is a growth, if you like, perhaps in the electoral success of Eurosceptic parties. You mentioned Brexit. This seems something which is very unlikely to happen again in the same way, perhaps because of Brexit itself. A lot of the polling shows that people who were possibly thinking in terms of exiting suddenly stopped thinking in terms of exiting when they saw what happened in reality.
And maybe we'll see a re-expansion to include the UK once again.
Well, that may be some way off. Yeah. No one's holding their breath over that. But I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned from that, in particularly how disinformation, when it flourishes, when a form of political populism flourishes, that the debates can go beyond sort of rational limits and end up in places which I suspect the political establishment did not expect. So that has happened. There are other places where there is an upswelling of political populism, if you want to call it that. Whether or not it actually leads to the same place is questionable. Certainly if you look at polling, even in Hungary, in terms of the population of that country. Should we be in the European Union? Is it good for our country to be in the European Union? Huge majorities say yes. So the basis is a little bit different.
Right, it certainly is. But it also leaves, as you mentioned, room for reform, potentially, correct? Now, talking about China, as Xi Jinping makes his European tour, he saw France, he went to Serbia, which is not a member, which maybe potentially aspires to become one someday, but Hungary is indeed a member, and poses another question when it comes to Chinese relations. We hear so much about de-risking across Europe, although that means very different things to different nations. Do you think Europe will come together to form a concrete policy as far as China is concerned, and one that maybe aligns or maybe doesn't align with that of the transatlantic relationship?
Okay, well, as they say, with China, it's complicated. It's a multifaceted relationship, I think, between the European Union and China. Obviously, a very important trading partner with a huge proportion of Europe's imports coming from China. This is something, and I know that the European Union is eager to have a constructive and positive relationship with China. Obviously, though, subject to certain concerns over human rights issues, certain security issues and so on. Xi now being in Europe, doing a tour, quite a lengthy tour by the look of it. Obviously, every member state has a right to maintain its bilateral relations, and that's, and I know Hungary, for example, for quite some time has endeavoured to have a positive relationship with China. The issue there for the European Union is to ensure that the decisions that are taken there don't go beyond the scope of our common interests as a European Union in those areas where the European Union is competent. So when it comes to trade relations overall, for example, when it comes to security matters, some of these things need to see a common line being taken. So there's nothing wrong with any member state of the European Union organising its own visits and having bilateral relations, but it's important also that those are within the wider framework of our European collective policy towards China.
We obviously have limited time, but I wanted to ask you about the upcoming parliamentary elections. Obviously, the last ones showed that there was a higher voter turnout. What are you expecting this time round, and why?
I think this is a trend that will probably continue. So the turnout was quite significantly up last time round by about 8 percentage points. Interestingly, inside that number, the number of young voters turning out increased more than the overall increase, which is quite interesting. I think in a way, it's common sense. If you look at what's happening in the world, if you look at what's on people's TV screens every day when it comes to the news, you're seeing climate change, you're seeing migration, you're seeing Ukraine, you're seeing issues which people can see are common issues on which Europe needs to have a unified position and a unified policy. And therefore, as an adjunct to that, you also see European politicians such as Ursula von der Leyen present on the TV screen in a way that many of her predecessors weren't. So I suspect, just simply the name recognition or the face recognition of European personalities is much higher than it was before. So in people's minds, Europe is more present, and therefore I think they'll be more interested.
But I'm going to challenge you on that. Is it not because people are actually more dissatisfied, and actually it's because the European Union is unable to handle some very crucial issues like the migration crisis, like the farmers' protests? We've just got some actually happening right now as we speak.
Yes, I understand that tomorrow there will be a significant protest here. It's not about people...
Or maybe the European
people
Union
loving
is actually
everything.
more involved
exactly,
in people's
this
lives.
is what I'm saying. It's not about people necessarily
way.
loving everything that the European Union does, but I think seeing the importance of what the European Union does is very important. It's like any political system in which you live. As an individual voter, you may not like this or that thing that is done by your government or by the system in which you live. But in a democracy, you have a chance every 5 years to do something about that. Yes, I would slightly contest some of the things you said in the sense that over the last few years, since we've been in this, what they call the poly crisis, starting with the financial crisis, the migration problem, the Brexit, COVID, Ukraine, I think the European Union, and I think people can see this, is getting better at reacting, is getting quicker at reacting, and it's actually coming up with solutions and acting in a more unified and immediate way. If you think back to the financial crisis, which is some time ago now, it started off all a bit of a mess, frankly, and there was a lot of argument going on within the European Union. We didn't see that with COVID, and we didn't see it with Ukraine. The reaction was much more solid and unified. So that is another reason I think that people will appreciate the fact that Europe is present, it is an actor, and it is something where it's important that everyone have their say about the direction of the European Union in the future. That's what elections are. And if you don't like the way things are going, as presumably some people who are protesting don't, then they have options when it comes to voting.
Right.
And just very briefly, there's a concern that there's a rise of populism, and that might change actually the direction of where the European Union, part of the European Parliament is going. How do you think that might, shape the European Parliament in the years to come?
There is the political picture. People will make up their minds about how they want to vote, and any political party which is signed up to our democratic system is absolutely legitimate in putting forward its programme, in asking people for their votes. Where we do have a problem potentially is in the area of disinformation and various other things which tend to undermine our democratic system. So I think one of the things which is really interesting about these elections and important is that we are in a different world now where, and this is very much the theme that we're working with, democracy itself cannot be taken for granted, and this is a vote which will enable us as Europeans to reaffirm our belief in one of our core values, which is democracy, which is under threat or is attacked in Ukraine very directly with guns, missiles and bombs, by disinformation and by certain forms of extremism, which are avowedly anti-democratic. Now, I think that is a problem which we should face. People will vote as they wish to vote, and it's certainly not my job or anyone else's to tell people how to do that. My job, as it were, is to encourage people to participate, to vote, to take part in this, because the legitimacy of the whole enterprise and the strength of our democracy depends on that participation.
Surely it
Absolutely.
does. Surely it does. Well, Stephen Clark, thank you very much for joining us today and discussing these issues concerning the European Union. And of course, we're looking forward to those
Absolutely.
European elections. Thank you.
Indeed.
Thank you very much indeed.